Hey guys, tonight we are doing something a little different. Instead of following one unlucky king with too many cousins, or one queen, whose family tree looked more like a family wreath, we are going to spend the night wandering through a world that almost every human being once knew, a world without electricity. So, if you are comfortable already, maybe pull the blanket a little higher, dim the lights, and perhaps appreciate the fact that you can dim the lights at all. For nearly all of human history, turning off the light meant blowing out a candle that had probably filled the room with smoke and smelled faintly of animal fat. Progress is funny like that. Tonight, we are going to drift through old villages, castles, crowded cities, lonely farms, and royal palaces. We are going to see what ordinary people ate, how they worked, how they slept, and how they managed to survive entire winters without electric heaters, refrigerators, or the comforting hum of a fan in the corner. And, strangely enough, they managed it, not always happily, not always comfortably, but they managed. The modern world is full of little invisible miracles. A switch on the wall gives you light. Another button starts a washing machine. Your phone quietly charges while you sleep. A refrigerator stands in the kitchen, endlessly battling the laws of thermodynamics, keeping your leftovers fresh for another day. We hardly notice these things because they are always there. Now imagine every one of those conveniences simply disappearing. No electric lights, no microwave, no vacuum cleaner, no alarm clock, no internet, obviously, which means if somebody wanted to argue with strangers, they had to do it face to face. Frankly, that alone might have saved civilization a few headaches. For thousands of years, the rhythm of human life was controlled almost entirely by the sun. People woke because daylight arrived. They slowed down because darkness came. Winter was quiet and difficult. Summer was busy and exhausting. The seasons were not just background scenery, they were the schedule. If you lived in a small farming village a few hundred years ago, your day would begin very early. Not because you had a motivational podcast telling you that successful people wake up at 4:30 in the morning, but because cows do not care about your personal growth journey. They expect to be milked. Chickens expect feeding. Crops expect attention. The entire farm is essentially one giant collection of living alarm clocks. You would wake up in a house that was probably darker than you might imagine. Even during daylight hours, many homes had very small windows. Glass was expensive for a long time, and in poorer regions, windows might simply be covered with shutters or oiled cloth. More sunlight would have been nice, but surviving winter was generally considered the higher priority. Tiny windows meant less heat escaped, and heat was precious. People today often imagine old houses as charming little cottages with warm fireplaces and cozy wooden furniture. In reality, many homes were smoky, cold, and surprisingly damp. The fireplace was the center of the house, but chimneys were not always very efficient. Smoke had an annoying tendency to stay indoors for a while before deciding to leave. Entire generations spent their lives slowly marinating in wood smoke. Of course, if you happened to be wealthy, things were somewhat better. Nobles and royals lived in castles and grand manor houses. Unfortunately for them, castles are basically giant stone refrigerators. They look magnificent in paintings, but thick stone walls are not exactly famous for trapping heat. Many medieval kings spent winter wrapped in layers of expensive fur, while sitting directly beside enormous fireplaces. Imagine ruling half of Europe and still having cold feet. And candles. We should probably talk about candles, because candles were the closest thing people had to portable electricity. Today you can fill an entire room with bright LED light for almost no cost. In the past, producing light after sunset required actual physical resources. Somebody had to make the candle. Somebody had to raise the animals that provided the fat or collect the beeswax. Then the candle slowly disappeared while it burned. Poor families often relied on tallow candles made from rendered animal fat. They worked, technically speaking, but they smelled memorable. There is a reason wealthy households preferred beeswax candles. They burned cleaner, lasted longer, and did not make the house smell like a butcher shop after a long day. So most ordinary people simply did not waste candles unless they absolutely needed them. When darkness came, work usually stopped. Families might gather around the hearth, talk quietly, mend clothing, repair tools, or tell stories. Grandparents passed down legends. Parents taught children practical skills. People entertained themselves with conversation because there were not many alternatives. No television, no streaming services, no scrolling endlessly through short videos while promising yourself you will sleep in just 5 more minutes. If someone in a medieval village said, "I have seen everything worth watching today," they genuinely meant it. They had probably watched a goat escape a fence, and maybe seen their neighbor fall into a muddy ditch. That was the entertainment budget for the week. Reading was also different. Books were rare and expensive for much of history. Before the printing press spread across Europe, copying a single book had countless hours of work by scribes. A large library was not a decorative background for social media photos. It was a declaration of enormous wealth. Even after books became more common, reading after dark required candlelight, which, as we have established, was expensive. So reading late into the night was often a luxury reserved for scholars, monks, or wealthy people with enough spare candles to support the habit. And then there was sleep itself. Modern sleep researchers have become interested in something called segmented sleep. Historical records suggest that many people did not always sleep for one uninterrupted 8-hour stretch. Instead, they often had a first sleep shortly after nightfall, then woke up for an hour or two around midnight, and finally returned for a second sleep. During that quiet period in the middle of the night, people might pray, chat, check on animals, or simply sit by their fading fire. It sounds unusual to us, but it may have felt perfectly normal to them. After all, when your entire schedule follows the natural cycle of daylight, there is less pressure to compress sleep into one perfectly organized block. Of course, sleeping conditions themselves were not exactly luxurious. Beds were expensive pieces of furniture. Many poorer families shared one bed with multiple relatives. Children often slept together. Servants might sleep on straw mattresses or simple piles of blankets near the kitchen fire. Travelers staying at crowded inns sometimes found themselves sharing a bed with complete strangers, which sounds awkward, because it absolutely was awkward. But if you had walked into a 17th century inn and complained about sharing your mattress with 3 unknown merchants and a man transporting live chickens, people might have looked at you with genuine confusion. That was just travel. Royal sleeping arrangements were not always much more private. European courts were famous for treating the personal lives of monarchs as public events. Important nobles could witness kings waking up, getting dressed, eating meals, and preparing for bed. Privacy was not especially fashionable. Imagine trying to have a peaceful bedtime routine while 15 aristocrats stand nearby discussing politics. Kings and queens despite all the jewels and crowns, were often trapped inside elaborate daily rituals. The French courts under Louis XIV turned almost every ordinary activity into a formal ceremony. The king waking up was an event. The king putting on his shoes was practically a performance. Someone, somewhere, had probably spent years hoping for the prestigious honor of handing the king his morning shirt. Human civilization is wonderfully strange, but whether you were a peasant farmer or the ruler of a kingdom, one truth connected almost everyone before the age of electricity. Night was genuinely dark. Modern cities glow all night long. Streetlights, signs, buildings, and cars create a permanent twilight. We rarely experience true darkness anymore, but before electric lighting, once the moon disappeared behind clouds and the candles burned low, the world could become astonishingly black. Traveling after sunset was risky. Roads were uneven, landmarks disappeared, and accidents happened easily. Many people simply avoided unnecessary journeys after dark. Ghost stories, folklore, and tales of strange creatures probably felt much more believable when you were walking alone down an empty road with only a tiny lantern and several miles left before home. And honestly, if you had spent the last 6 hours listening to wolves howl in the distance while carrying a candle made of sheep fat, you might have believed in a few forest spirits too. As we slowly wander further into this pre-electric world, we will discover that almost every ordinary task required more time, more labor, and much more patience than it does today. Cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, preserving food, and even finding enough clean water to drink could consume an entire day's effort. Life was slower, not because people wanted a simpler existence, but because the technology to make life faster simply did not exist. And so, while we still have our warm blankets, quiet rooms, and little glowing devices beside the bed, let us drift gently into that older world together. A place lit by fire instead of bulbs, guided by the sun instead of clocks, and held together by habits that lasted 4,000 of years before someone finally looked at a dark room and thought ... There really should be an easier way to do this. Hey guys, tonight we begin by leaving behind the comfortable little glow of the modern world. Maybe your room has a lamp in the corner. Maybe your phone screen is still lighting up your face every few seconds with notifications that can absolutely wait until tomorrow. Whatever the case, you have light whenever you want it. You press a button, and the darkness politely moves aside. For almost all of human history, though, darkness did not politely move anywhere. It arrived every evening, slowly swallowing roads, fields, forests, and entire cities. And once it settled in, people generally accepted that the day was over. Not because they had suddenly become lazy. Quite the opposite. They had already been working since sunrise. But because wandering around outside after sunset was often an excellent way to get lost, robbed, bitten by something unpleasant, or simply walk directly into a muddy ditch. So tonight, settle in, get comfortable, and let your eyes grow a little heavy as we drift through the strange and surprisingly quiet history of what people feared after the sun went down. We are not chasing grand battles or exciting adventures. In fact, the people we are talking about usually wanted exactly the opposite. They wanted to make it through the night with the doors locked, the fire still burning, and no mysterious noises coming from the woods. A fairly modest ambition, really. The first thing to understand is that pre-modern darkness was not the same darkness we know today. Even if you live far from a city, there is usually some distant glow on the horizon. Streetlights, cars, houses, maybe a convenience store bravely selling snacks at 2 in the morning. A medieval villager had none of that. Step outside after moonset, and the world could become almost completely black. The kind of darkness where you can hear your own footsteps, but cannot quite see where they land. The kind of darkness where a familiar path suddenly feels unfamiliar, and every oddly shaped tree begins to look like a person standing very still. Of course, the human imagination has never needed much encouragement. Every culture filled the night with stories. Spirits wandered lonely roads, fairies danced in empty fields. Ghosts appeared near old churches, strange creatures watched travelers from deep forests. Some legends were ancient, passed down over countless generations. Others were probably invented by exhausted parents who simply wanted their children to stop sneaking outside after bedtime. And honestly, do not go into the woods after dark, because there is a monster, was probably more effective than a detailed lecture about walls and uneven terrain. The forests themselves deserved a certain amount of respect. Europe, for example, once contained vast stretches of woodland that seemed endless to the people living nearby. Villages were tiny islands of firelight, surrounded by great oceans of trees. During the day, a forest was a source of timber, mushrooms, berries, and game. At night, it became a place where sound behaved strangely. Branches creaked, animals moved through the undergrowth. Owls called out across the darkness. If you had never heard an owl before, and many people had not, the noise could sound surprisingly human. You can almost picture some tired farmer standing outside his cottage around midnight, hearing an owl shriek from the forest and quietly deciding that whatever was happening out there was not his problem. He would investigate tomorrow, maybe. And then there were wolves. Modern fairy tales often turn wolves into dramatic villains, but for much of history, they were simply another hazard of rural life. They usually avoided people, but hunger changes calculations. During especially harsh winters, wolves occasionally approached villages, looking for livestock and, in rare cases, easier opportunities. This meant that the sound of distant howling carried a very different meaning than it does today. It was not a cinematic soundtrack. It was a reminder that nature was still very much in charge. Even kings and queens were not entirely separated from these worries. Royal hunting lodges and castles often stood near enormous forests. Noble families spent weeks hunting deer and boar, partly for food, partly for sport, and partly because medieval aristocrats had a remarkable talent for turning dangerous hobbies into social events. Of course they did, and while nobles liked to imagine themselves as fearless hunters, many of them were just as superstitious as everyone else. A strange dream, a comet in the sky, or an unusual animal sighting could be interpreted as a sign that something unfortunate was about to happen. The medieval and early modern world loved symbols. If a raven landed on the wrong roof, somebody would worry. If a dog howled outside a window at midnight, somebody would probably assume disaster was approaching. If a candle suddenly went out for no obvious reason, half the room might quietly cross themselves. Looking back, it is easy to smile at these beliefs. But it is also worth remembering that people lived with very little information. They had no weather forecasts, no scientific explanation for disease, and no emergency services to call if something went wrong. The unknown was enormous. Superstition filled the empty spaces. Let's float over to another little royal disaster. Take the life of many medieval monarchs, and you quickly discover that sleeping peacefully was surprisingly difficult. Kings worried about plots. Queens worried about succession. Princes worried about ambitious uncles, and ambitious uncles worried that they were not yet kings. The family dynamics were, to put it gently, unhealthy. A ruler might sleep surrounded by guards, thick walls, unlocked doors, but fear had a way of following people indoors. Several European monarchs became obsessed with omens and prophecies. Some carried religious relics for protection. Others consulted astrologers before making important decisions. Imagine being the royal astrologer. You spend years studying the stars, only to have a nervous king wake you up at 3 in the morning because he had a strange dream involving a goose and now wants to know if the kingdom is doomed. History is full of jobs that sound glamorous until you think about them for 5 seconds. And then there were cities after dark. Modern cities never really sleep. Medieval cities absolutely tried to. Once evening arrived, gates closed, shops shut their doors. Many streets had little or no lighting at all. A person carrying a lantern became a tiny moving island of visibility surrounded by darkness. Some cities hired night watchmen to patrol the streets, calling out the hours and keeping an eye out for fires or trouble. The job sounds simple enough. Walk around, stay awake, yell the time every so often, try not to get robbed. In practice, many watchmen were elderly, underpaid, and not especially enthusiastic about chasing criminals through dark alleyways. If a suspicious noise came from the next street over, there was always a chance they would decide that perhaps it was just the wind. A very noisy wind, carrying somebody else's wallet. Fire, strangely enough, was often feared more than thieves. In a town filled with wooden buildings, open flames, and thatched roofs, one careless candle could become everyone's problem. Entire neighborhoods could vanish overnight. So families were cautious. Fires were checked before bed. Embers were covered. Lamps were extinguished. Nighttime silence was occasionally broken by the cry of fire, and those few moments probably sent more panic through a community than almost anything else. There is an odd irony hiding here. People feared the darkness, but they also feared the very thing that pushed the darkness away. Candles could fall over. Lanterns could break. Fireplaces could spread sparks. The one tool people depended on for warmth and safety could also destroy everything they owned. And perhaps that constant balancing act explains why evenings often became so quiet. Families gathered close together. Doors were locked. Animals were brought inside or secured in barns. Stories were told around the hearth, partly for entertainment and partly because there was not much else to do. Children listened to tales of ghosts, witches, and wandering spirits. Grandparents repeated old local legends. Travelers brought stories from distant lands, where apparently every abandoned castle had at least one unhappy phantom drifting through the hallways. Castles themselves, by the way, were excellent places for ghost stories. They were large, drafty, full of echoing corridors, and often built over the remains of older structures. Wine slipped through cracks in the walls. Wooden beams shifted during the night. Doors creaked for no obvious reason. A servant carrying a single candle through a long stone hallway could easily convince himself that someone was following him, or perhaps he was just hearing his own footsteps bouncing off the walls. Hopefully. Let's wander quietly into one final corner of the night before we rest there for a while. One of the greatest fears people carried into darkness was not monsters or wolves or spirits. It was uncertainty. If a family member became seriously ill after sunset, there was little to do but wait. Doctors were scarce. Travel was difficult. Bad weather could cut off entire villages. A storm at night might damage crops, flood roads, or destroy roofs, and nobody could do much about it until morning arrived. The sunrise itself became a kind of comfort. It brought visibility, warmth, work, familiar routines, a chance to discover that the strange noise outside had merely been a wandering sheep, or that the terrifying shadow near the fence was just an old tree stump that somehow looked much taller in the moonlight. Human beings are wonderfully imaginative creatures. Give us a dark forest, a flickering candle, and a slightly unusual noise, and our minds will happily create an entire supernatural explanation before considering the possibility that a goat simply escaped again. And perhaps that is the gentle lesson hidden inside the long history of nighttime fear. The people of the past were not especially different from us. They worried about their families. They locked their doors. They told stories to explain the unknown. They listened to the wind outside and hoped tomorrow would be ordinary. Because, after all, in a world without electric lights, without emergency phones, and without the reassuring glow of a city beyond the window, an ordinary quiet night was actually a very precious thing. So as the fire burns lower and the village slowly falls asleep around us, we will leave those old roads and silent forests behind for now. And in the next part, we will drift gently into the curious routines of midnight watchmen, lonely travelers, and the surprisingly exhausting business of simply surviving until dawn. Hey guys, tonight we begin in a place that most of us try very hard to avoid. Not a battlefield, not a haunted castle, not even one of those royal family reunions where everyone is somehow both your cousin and your future spouse. No, tonight we are simply going to sit quietly in the cold. So, get comfortable, pull the blanket up a little, maybe appreciate the heater, the fan, or the warm little pocket of air inside your room. Maybe even spare a grateful thought for the thermostat on the wall. That small plastic box is performing a kind of magic that would have completely amazed almost every human who ever lived, because for thousands of years, staying warm was not a convenience, it was a full-time job. The modern world has a strange way of hiding effort. You press a button, and warm air appears. You complain that it takes 20 seconds for the shower water to heat up, which, if you think about it, is a wonderfully luxurious complaint. A medieval farmer would have heard that, and quietly stared at you, while carrying two heavy buckets from a frozen well. The truth is that almost everyone in history, from the poorest villager to some of the richest kings in Europe, spent an enormous amount of time thinking about heat, how to make it, how to keep it, and how to stop it from escaping through every tiny crack in the walls. Winter was not a season, it was an opponent. For ordinary families living in small cottages, the fireplace was the center of everything. It was the kitchen, the heater, the gathering place, and sometimes the only source of light once evening arrived. The entire household naturally arranged itself around that little patch of warmth. Cooking happened there, repairs happened there, storytelling happened there. If someone wanted to avoid freezing, they happened there too. Of course, maintaining a fire was easier said than done. Firewood had to come from somewhere. Trees did not politely chop themselves into manageable pieces. Someone had to cut them down, split the logs, stack them, keep them dry, and carry them indoors. Throughout the year, families quietly built enormous wood piles, hoping they had guessed correctly how much they would need before spring returned. Running out of firewood in the middle of winter was the historical equivalent of watching your phone battery drop to 1% with no charger nearby. Except, instead of losing access to social media, you lost access to not freezing, and if wood was scarce, people became creative. Peat, dried animal dung, bundles of brushwood, and even straw could be burned for heat. None of these options smelled particularly elegant. The romantic image of the cozy old cottage begins to fade a little when you realize that many homes were heated by whatever happened to catch fire without being too valuable to burn. Let's float gently over to the castles for a moment, because surely kings and queens had solved this little heating problem. Well, not exactly. Castles looked magnificent from the outside. Tall towers, thick stone walls, grand halls, impressive gates. They also had one small design flaw. Stone is extremely good at being cold. A medieval castle in winter was often less like a palace and more like an enormous decorative icebox. The thick walls protected against enemies, but they also absorbed the cold and held onto it with remarkable determination. Huge fireplaces were built into the great halls, and servants worked constantly to keep them burning, but the heat rarely traveled very far. You could stand directly beside the fire and feel almost comfortable. Then you would take 5 steps away and suddenly remember that it was January. Kings slept beneath heavy curtains that surrounded their beds, partly for privacy, but mostly because the curtains trapped a little warm air. Thick blankets, woolen sheets, and luxurious animal furs were layered together in heroic attempts to defeat the weather. Even then, success was not guaranteed. There is something wonderfully humbling about the idea that one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe would spend an evening wrapped in 3 bear skins, sitting beside a roaring fire, still complaining that his feet were cold. And honestly, he probably was. The wealthy certainly had advantages. They could afford more fireplaces, more servants, and better fuel. But before central heating, money only solved the problem up to a point. Heat was stubborn. It gathered around the fire and refused to travel to the rest of the building. Bedrooms, hallways, staircases, and storage rooms could become miserably cold. Visitors often noted that grand palaces looked luxurious, but felt surprisingly uncomfortable in winter. The Palace of Versailles is a good example. Today it attracts millions of visitors who admire its beauty. But living there year-round was another matter entirely. The halls were enormous, the ceilings were high. Hundreds and eventually thousands of people crowded into the complex, heating all of that space, nearly impossible. Nobles wore layer upon layer of expensive clothing, not simply to show off their wealth, but because they genuinely needed the extra insulation. Of course, being aristocrats, they managed to transform practical winter clothing into a complicated fashion competition. Why wear one decorative coat when you could wear 3? Why stop there when you could add lace, embroidery, velvet, silk, and a hat large enough to shelter a family of sparrows? History repeatedly demonstrates that wealthy people have never met a practical problem they could not make slightly more complicated. Clothing, in fact, was one of the greatest defenses against cold. Most people owned garments made from wool, because wool keeps warmth even when damp. Linen was common underneath, while the rich could add fur linings from foxes, martens, or other animals. Cloaks became essential. Hoods covered the ears. Gloves and mittens, where available, were treasured. Children often wore miniature versions of adult clothing, because there was little concept of a separate children's fashion industry. Besides, Nobody was about to invent cartoon-themed winter jackets when surviving until spring was already keeping everyone busy. And then there was the problem of sleeping. Modern homes cooled down a little at night, but pre-industrial houses could become brutally cold by morning. The fire was often allowed to die down to save fuel, leaving families dependent on blankets and body heat. People commonly slept together for exactly this reason. Entire families might share a bed. Servants slept alongside other servants. Travelers shared mattresses with complete strangers at roadside inns. Personal space was a luxury. Warmth was a necessity. Imagine arriving at an inn after a long day's journey and discovering that your sleeping arrangements included a merchant, a local baker, and a gentleman who had spent the afternoon transporting geese. You might object. The innkeeper, however, would simply shrug. The bed is warm. The geese seem friendly enough. Problem solved. One surprisingly clever invention was the bed warmer. Wealthy households sometimes filled a metal pan with hot coals and slid it between the sheets before bedtime. Servants carefully moved it around to warm the mattress before removing it again. Simple, effective, and only slightly concerning if someone forgot the remove it again part. The Romans, centuries earlier, had approached heating with their usual determination to engineer absolutely everything. Wealthy Roman villas and public bathhouses sometimes used a system called a hypocaust. Hot air from a furnace flowed beneath raised floors and through hollow spaces in the walls, gently warming the rooms above. It was, in many ways, a very early form of central heating. Unfortunately, it was expensive to build and maintain. It required constant fuel and labor. When the Western Roman Empire declined, many of these advanced systems gradually disappeared in parts of Europe, leaving later generations to rediscover the deeply exciting technology of sitting closer to a fireplace. Progress is not always a straight line. Let's wander quietly into another little royal inconvenience. Many famous rulers absolutely hated the cold. Peter the Great of Russia embraced it with unusual enthusiasm, marching through snow and expecting everyone else to do the same. Others were less adventurous. Several European monarchs migrated between different palaces, depending on the season, chasing comfort long before luxury winter vacations became fashionable. Meanwhile, ordinary villagers had no such option. They remained where they were, hoping the harvest had been good enough and the winter not too long. A harsh winter could affect everything. Rivers froze, making travel difficult. Mills stopped working. Food supplies shrank. Livestock required extra care. The entire community slowed down, conserving energy while waiting for warmer days. It is easy to forget that before modern heating and transportation, weather had direct control over daily life. A cold season was not just an inconvenience. It shaped work schedules, diets, clothing, architecture, and even social customs. Families naturally gathered close to the fire in the evenings. Stories were shared, clothes were repaired, tools were fixed. Children listened while older relatives repeated familiar tales that had probably been told beside similar fires for generations. There is a certain quiet charm in that image, not because the past was easier. It definitely was not. Most people would happily trade smoky cottages and frozen bedrooms for modern radiators without a second thought. But there was a rhythm to those evenings, a shared closeness created by necessity. When one little fire is all that stands between your family and a freezing winter night, everyone ends up sitting together. And perhaps that is one of the stranger ironies of history. The same cold that made life difficult also brought people closer. It gathered farmers, craftsmen, servants, kings, queens, children, and grandparents around the same glowing hearth. The flames cracked softly, the wind pushed against the walls outside. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked or an owl called across the fields. Inside, people waited for morning. They added another log to the fire, pulled the blankets a little tighter, and hoped that the woodpile outside was just a bit larger than they remembered. Because in a world before electricity, before furnaces, and before the gentle click of a thermostat, surviving winter was never guaranteed. It was simply another quiet challenge that almost every human being had to face, one cold evening at a time. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that modern people rarely have to think about. Not kings, not queens, not the latest royal cousin marriage that somehow seemed like a good political strategy at the time. We are going to spend tonight talking about the simple, quiet art of staying alive. So get comfortable, pull the blanket a little closer, maybe appreciate the fact that your house is probably warm, your kitchen probably contains food, and there is a very good chance that clean water comes out of a tap somewhere nearby. Those are such ordinary little miracles that we almost never stop to notice them. For most of human history, though, basic survival was not something you solved once and forgot about. It was the main project of every single day. Wake up, find water, keep the fire going, take care of the animals, fix something that broke yesterday, prepare food, try not to waste anything, go to sleep, wake up and do it all again. And honestly, after a while, you can understand why so many ancient philosophers spent their time wondering about the meaning of life. If you had just spent 3 hours carrying water and another 4 chopping wood, you might start asking a few deep questions too. The strange thing is that we often imagine the lives of ordinary people and royalty as completely different worlds. In some ways, they certainly were. Kings owned palaces. Farmers owned a goat and perhaps a very stubborn chicken. One dined from silver plates, the other hoped the bread lasted until next week. But when it came to basic survival, everyone was still fighting the same ancient problems. Cold weather did not care if you wore a crown. Illness ignored noble titles. Crops failed for rich and poor alike. A hard winter had a way of reminding everyone that nature was still making the rules. Let's begin with the one thing no one could live without: water. Today, water arrives almost magically. Turn a handle, and there it is. Cold, clean, and ready whenever you need it. A medieval villager would have considered this the work of powerful wizards. For everyone else, getting water meant work. Villages were often built near rivers, streams, or wells for a very simple reason. Walking long distances carrying heavy buckets every day becomes old surprisingly quickly. Even then, collecting enough water for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and animals could consume a large part of the morning. The buckets themselves were not especially light. Add water, and suddenly every trip felt like an unplanned exercise session. Of course, people did not always get perfectly clean water. Wells could become contaminated. Rivers served many purposes at once. Water might be used for washing clothes, watering animals, and, unfortunately, disposing of waste. Medieval sanitation was not exactly famous for its elegance. This is one reason that people often drank small amounts of weak beer or ale during the day. The brewing process made the liquid safer than questionable water sources in many places. So yes, there were periods in history when children were occasionally drinking very mild ale because it was considered the safer option. History has a remarkable talent for making modern parenting debates seem relatively simple. Now, while someone was gathering water, somebody else was probably dealing with the fire. A fire was not just a source of warmth, it was the center of survival itself. Without it, there was no cooked food, no heated water, and very little comfort once the sun disappeared. Families guarded their fires carefully. In some places, if the household fire accidentally went out, neighbors would help relight it, because starting one from scratch was inconvenient and sometimes difficult. It is easy to forget that matches are a very recent invention. Earlier generations relied on flint and steel, preserved embers, or other methods that required patience and practice. There was no tiny lighter waiting in a kitchen drawer. Imagine spending 15 minutes trying to start a fire before you could even think about making breakfast. Suddenly, a faulty toaster does not seem quite so tragic. Food itself was another endless concern. Modern supermarkets quietly hide an enormous amount of work. Fruit appears in winter. Bread is available every day. If one shop runs out of eggs, another shop is usually 5 minutes away. A medieval family had no such backup plan. Much of the year revolved around preparing for the seasons ahead. During harvest time, everyone worked. Grain had to be gathered and stored. Vegetables were dried or preserved. Meat might be salted or smoked. Herbs were collected. Fruit was turned into jams or dried for later use. The goal was simple: convince enough food to survive until spring, and if the harvest was poor, there was not much anyone could do about it. There were no refrigerated trucks bringing supplies from another country. There was no emergency delivery service. A bad harvest meant difficult months ahead. Let's drift quietly into the kitchens of the past. They were warm places, but not always pleasant ones. Smoke lingered in the air. Pots hung over open flames. Bread baked in communal ovens. Soup simmered for hours, with ingredients added whenever something useful appeared. A pot of stew could become a sort of ongoing family project. Add vegetables, add beans, add a little grain. Perhaps a piece of salted meat if fortune happened to smile upon you. And if yesterday's stew looked suspiciously similar to today's stew, well, nobody was writing restaurant reviews. Royal kitchens, naturally, operated on an entirely different scale. A king's household might employ dozens of cooks, bakers, butchers, and servants. Vast quantities of food arrived every day: deer, fish, birds, bread, cheese, wine, spices from distant lands. But there is an amusing little detail hidden beneath all that luxury. The king still depended completely on other people. A royal banquet looked magnificent, but behind the scenes, it was a giant machine powered by servants carrying wood, hauling water, cleaning dishes, roasting meat, and trying very hard not to ruin dinner. A monarch could command armies, but he probably could not bake his own loaf of bread. And honestly, there is something oddly comforting about that. The great and powerful often looked much less impressive when faced with ordinary household tasks. Let's float over to clothing for a moment. Owning clothes was not the same as owning fashion. Most people had a few practical outfits, carefully repaired over and over again. Tears were stitched, shoes were patched, cloaks were handed down through generations. Nothing was wasted. Fabric required time and labor. Wool had to be sheared, cleaned, spun, woven, and sewn. Linen involved its own long process. A simple shirt represented many hours of work before anyone even wore it. Laundry, meanwhile, was not a quick weekend chore. It could take an entire day. Water had to be collected and heated. Clothes were scrubbed by hand, beaten clean, rinsed, and hung to dry. Heavy blankets and thick wool garments were especially difficult. Modern washing machines quietly perform a small historical miracle every single week. And then there were houses themselves. People often imagine medieval homes as picturesque little cottages with flowers outside and smoke gently rising from the chimney. Some certainly looked charming from a distance. From the inside, though, life was a little less romantic. Roofs leaked, walls cracked, animals were sometimes kept very close to people for warmth and security. Chickens wandered about. Dogs slept near the fire. Cats performed a valuable public service of hunting mice, usually while behaving as though they personally owned the building. A family was constantly fixing things. Fences broke, tools wore out. Roofs needed patching. Wooden carts lost wheels. Everyday survival involved endless little repairs that could not be postponed because there was nobody else coming to solve the problem. If the roof leaked, you fixed the roof. If the bucket cracked, you repaired the bucket. If the goat escaped ... and it almost certainly escaped, then everyone stopped what they were doing and went looking for the goat. History, despite the castles and crowns, contains a surprising amount of time spent chasing uncooperative livestock. Now, while ordinary villagers worked to maintain these simple routines, noble families faced their own curious version of survival. Their problems were larger, stranger, and often self-inflicted. A peasant worried about having enough grain for winter. A king worried that his brother might decide to claim the throne. A queen worried about producing an heir. A prince worried that he might be married to a second cousin he had never met. And very often he was. European royal families spent centuries arranging marriages between the same handful of dynasties. The political logic made sense. Keep alliances strong. Keep power concentrated. Keep wealth inside the family. The biological consequences were ... somewhat less successful. Several royal houses became famous for inherited illnesses and distinctive physical features. The Habsburg dynasty, for example, developed such a recognizable jawline that modern historians can often identify family portraits from across a room. He was called the Handsome in a few flattering court descriptions, but if we are being gently honest, some portraits suggest he looked a little like a half-finished potato carved by an optimistic sculptor. Still, even these powerful families spent their evenings in much the same way as everyone else. Fires burned low, candles flickered, doors were locked against the night. Servants checked the kitchens, guards walked the walls. Somewhere, a child was being told a familiar old story, while an elderly grandparent quietly repaired a torn piece of clothing beside the hearth. The details changed. The castles were larger, the clothes were finer, the meals contained more courses, but beneath all the decorations and ceremonies, the oldest human concerns remained exactly the same. Stay warm, find food, protect the family, save enough for tomorrow, hope the weather behaves, Hope nobody gets sick. Hope the harvest is good. And perhaps most importantly of all, hope that the little fire in the middle of the room keeps burning until morning. Because before electricity, before supermarkets, before running water and central heating, survival was not a dramatic adventure. It was 1,000 quiet habits repeated every single day. A careful routine built by generations who learned that wasting food, wasting fuel, or wasting daylight was a luxury they simply could not afford. So as the evening settles gently around our little historical village, and the fire crackles softly beside us, we can leave these families to their work. The buckets have been filled, the bread is baking, the animals are quiet for now, the doors are closed against the darkness outside, and tomorrow, just as they did yesterday, they will wake with the sunrise and begin the whole ancient process all over again.